Hello, listener, and welcome to our podcast. My name is Megan McCarter, and I will be introducing on behalf of the Gold Team for Political Science 350. Today, we're going to be talking about police versus community relations and how those things are still affecting today's world. We're hoping to improve and offer some solutions for these topics. First, our topics of study will include history of police, which will be offered by me, and then current relations, police shielded by law, cop on people of color violence, fixing the problem, and any additional info we feel like we need to include. First, I'm going to start by my topic, which is, as I mentioned, history of police versus community relations. There are many things to talk about, but I first wanted to start with just the basics of slavery. First, we need to give a quick outline. The beginning of racism, or slavery, is what I'm going to call the first part, and then the last 100 years, or how things have evolved since. Racism and slavery have always been evident and may always be evident. Slavery was the beginning of the most prominent form of racism, and of course it's been around for centuries. For hundreds of years, European civilization made blacks and many other racial minorities work for free labor. Of course, there are many ethical boundaries that were passed when things like this started to occur. And their only reasoning behind it was pretty much their skin color. They were labeled as inferior, dumb, criminal, etc. And we're going to see these assumptions and stereotypes played out later today. As we continue, they were seen as sinful and associated with the devil. Some examples can be when you see pictures of the devil, sometimes he's always drawn as black or a very dark color. And oftentimes when Jesus is portrayed in art or history or etc., he's usually white, which is very interesting considering if you think about it, he's probably more of a Middle Eastern kind of skin color, which definitely it would not be white. But moving on, slavery has consisted of more than just free labor, and it has definitely dehumanized blacks, African Americans, and other racial minorities. Today we can see that. And besides cheap labor, they were definitely used for rape, murder, beating, and far more cruel examples. They were treated like cattle rather than people, and this can be found in the Three-Fifths Compromise, which I want to talk about briefly. It pretty much just said under the Constitution that blacks were 3/5 of a person rather than 5/5 or a complete person. They were definitely seen as 3/5, which is almost half of a complete person, a little over. And because of this, they didn't have the right to vote, own property. They were prevented from basic constitutional rights just because they weren't seen as a complete whole 5 of 5 kind of person. Rather, it was 3/5. And that info has come from blackpast.org, and that's according to their information that I have there, as well as other historical examples of slavery. And just a brief description can be made for the triangular trade and the Middle Passage. I found all my info on abolition.org/slavery, and many of it was just the moving of slaves from Africa to America. They were brutally put on these ships, and they were expected to basically live on these ships with many European civilizations, and they're just ideas from there. And they were pretty much put on these ships. They were forced to, piss on themselves, and they weren't allowed to move. They were stuck in these shackles. Oftentimes they didn't have any clothes while they were traveling over the sea. It was just a terrible, terrible environment, and they were forced to kind of live under those conditions. But today there is still some of these effects from these labors, and definitely blacks still suffer greatly, despite slavery not even being technically legal. Stereotypes from slavery are evident, such as, like I mentioned earlier, being criminal, dumb, loud, obnoxious. Those were many ideals that Europeans and even other colonized people believed that blacks and racial minorities were to be, and that has definitely stemmed from past, and now we can see that today. Because of these stereotypes, many people suffer and they face charges and crimes they do not commit in today's society, and there's a substantial amount of black people who have been murdered by the police today, which we will go into further, especially as we reach today's current events and the environment that racial minorities have to live in. Institutional racism is definitely embedded into society from years of construction. It is real. Today, there are a lot of talk about whether institutional racism is current, whether it existed at all, whether it went away once slavery was illegalized, but obviously that is definitely still embedded into society, and we can see that from the examples that I will be talking about later on. But everyone describes slavery as racism in the worst form, which obviously it was a terrible form, and it definitely is not something that is, it's definitely dehumanizing and disgusting in many, many ways. But I wouldn't say that just because slavery doesn't exist, that racism cannot exist. While they correlate, they are not completely dependent on one another, and just because you have one doesn't mean you can't have the other. Police and law enforcement was not institutionalized until around the mid 1800s, which from today would be about 200 years ago. The first American the first American police department was established in Boston in 1838. But as African Americans fled the horrors of the Jim Crow South, they too became the victims of brutal and punitive policing in the northern cities where they were sought refuge. All of this information is coming from an article which is called Just the Last 100 Years of Policing and Slavery. Jim Crow laws were state and local regulations that prevented blacks from obtaining equality and were implemented to segregate. But I do want to move on to this next subject and just make sure that as I go over these things, I just summarize things. So obviously I just talked about slavery and the kind of stereotypes and effects that it's had on today. The Three-Fifths Compromise and the Triangular Trade and Middle Passage are just a few examples of those. And then just the basic police and law enforcement that really wasn't institutionalized until mid-1800s. But today, the last 100 years, we found most of this information from the Smithsonian.com. There is a few articles there, as well as the past 100 years article that I just mentioned. There is a lot of time in between the beginning of slavery and today, especially the last 100 years, which would be like the 1900s to kind of 2000s, I think is where my range is about. So additionally, there's much racism and its affiliation with law enforcement to fit into this topic, but I do find it vital to talk about these small pieces. So instead, it would be smart to focus on just the last 100 years and how they affected the Black community and police relations, rather than covering the past few centuries, because I just don't think, obviously, that is doable or reasonable at this point. But for the future, in accordance with this article, it may be beneficial just to consider police violence a form of domestic terrorism. I definitely think there's an argument that could be made there, that definitely what is happening today is a form of domestic terrorism because you are targeting a marginalized group and you are definitely murdering, harming, hospitalizing many of those people who obviously are citizens within the United States who call this nation their home, and attacking them within their nation, and these police or institutionalized law enforcement individuals also being a part of this nation. So I think there is an argument there of this being domestic terrorism. And recently, the Black Lives Matter movement issues have existed for a long time, but they are still unresolved, and that movement has definitely become something that is more talked about today and is more accepted today, and there are many people who are willing to promote this movement, and it has definitely become very popular. But moving on, from 1972 to 1928 is about where I'm going to start. And Africans were made up just 5% of the area's population. They constituted 30% of the victims of police killings, the survey revealed from Chicago statistics. Of course, again, this information is coming from my article of the past 100 years. But President Hoover attempted to implement what was known as the National Commission of Law Observance and Enforcement, which was made to change policy and the way police worked. Of course, at this time, not much of it worked, mainly because at this point in time, not many were willing, especially 1927 to 1928, not many people were still willing to listen to racial minorities. They didn't believe what they had to say. And at this point, slavery was definitely something that was still being battled in a way. It was definitely still common to ignore the voices of racial minorities. And the realities of police brutality came to light, even though the commission did not address racial disparities outright, which pretty much just means that, as I said before, the proof came out when the National Commission of Law Observance and Enforcement was released, but nothing was done about it. Nothing was addressed, and in response, racial minorities were obviously continued to be oppressed and segregated. So the statistics and information was true and evident, but there was little to be done about it. And the commission showed segregation and poverty as indicators, which is obviously still apparent today, and once again can be brought back to today's world. So I think there is something to be said there as well in regards to segregation and current poverty as it involves racial minorities and blacks. But skipping ahead a few years, just again because there's just so information within the last 100 years, I'm going to kind of go to the 1960s riots, especially since it is introduced with Martin Luther King Jr., which is a known speaker on behalf of the black community himself. He was definitely respected even by white individuals just because of his education, his speech skills, and despite all of that, there were definitely some who saw him as a rock for the black community, and he definitely is, even to this day. He is taught to be that. But it pretty much, his first I Have a Dream speech at the 1963 riot is definitely a historically well-known speech that happened. We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. So that was just one of the many quotes that I found interesting. But 1960 was a big year of the movement for police brutality, and Martin Luther King speaking on behalf of that was quite interesting. And in return, one of the deadliest riots occurred in New York in Newark in 1967 after police officers severely beat black cab driver John Smith during a traffic stop. 26 people died and many others were injured during the 4 days of arrest. In 1968, President Lyndon B. The Rodney King riots, I'm skipping again ahead a few years, but this information I found from another article, When LA Erupted in Anger, a look back at the Rodney King riots. It's just from npr.org, and it just gives a lot of information of what has happened within the past historical years and just the effects of those riots. I definitely think as we move from the 1960 riots to the Rodney King riots, there's about 20-30 years in between, about 30-40 years in between the 1960s riots and the Rodney King riots. But there is something to be said about the Rodney King riots, especially the gruesome violence that happened within those and the amount of anger that is probably justified when you give more consideration about it. But pretty much things did seem to calm down a bit. There was still much violence, oppression, and injustice happening between the 1960s and the 1990s. But I wanted to focus on, these main examples so that way I can give you a complete rundown of what is happening within the past 100 years. And I feel like these riots are definitely have something to say, especially with the recent riots within 2020, along with the pandemic happening. So I wanted to give a big focus on these events that have come about, especially since the 1990s, was only about 30 years ago. It's been very current, and it's something to be said. But around 1991, a man named Rodney King was pulled over for driving under the influence, when in fact he was eventually dragged out of his car and severely beaten for pretty much no reason. But the significance was it was caught on tape and has since been a great evidence for injustice. Even in the 1990s, I think things kind of calmed down, just because at that point, like, there was definitely a voice being heard on the behalf of the Black community. Not to say they weren't being oppressed, but at that point it definitely wasn't the significant oppression that the 1960s riots may have been dreading or fighting. So at this point, catching something like that on tape was definitely influential. And ultimately, 4 officers were charged with excessive use of force. A year later, on April 29th of 1992, a jury consisting of 12 residents from the distant suburbs of Virginia County, 9 white, 1 Latino, 1 biracial, 1 Asian, found the 4 officers not guilty, which was obviously very significant. Rightly so, the Black community and its supporters were appalled. No justice was taken, and the men who nearly killed another man, or Rodney King, walked away with pretty much no repercussions. And then at this point, that's when the riots began. And so this could be described as some of the most brutal, deadliest riots in history. Myself, I watched a documentary on it because I've had a class focused on this information, on the riots especially. And just during those 5 days of unrest, there were more than 50 riot-related deaths, including 10 people who were shot and killed by LAPD officers and National Guardsmen. More than 2,000 people were injured, and nearly 6,000 alleged looters and arsonists were arrested. I think there's definitely something to be said about the National Guardsmen that were sent out during these riots. Obviously, that is excessive violence and a reputation that is being set there, that these riots of people who are just expressing themselves in multiple different ways, it is so excessive to have sent out National Guardsmen. I definitely understand, obviously, where they're coming with sending out officers, especially when those relations are so involved with police officers and the Black community itself. But I think that can definitely be said for today, too, during these 2020 riots, when Army men and National Guardsmen, these people who have had years of excessive violent training for war itself, are being sent to calm down citizens who are rightly justified to be upset and angered. But there's definitely something to be said about people who are trained to be in war being sent out to citizens of your nation. And I think, once again, that brings back to the argument of domestic violence and terrorism. It's very excessive to have sent out these individuals. But moving on, of these arrested during the riots, 36% were African American, which is nearly 50%, and 51% were Latinos, according to the Rand Corp. So that means that's a total of 87% of these people were either African Americans or Latinos, which makes me wonder what the other 13% could possibly be. But let me tell you, it definitely probably was not white citizens. And moving on, more than 1,000 buildings were damaged, and approximately 2,000 Korean-run businesses were also damaged or destroyed. And in all, approximately $1 billion worth of property was destroyed, just based on all of this information. And again, this is coming from the NPR.org article. But there is something also to be said about the 2,000 Korean-run businesses. During this time, especially during the riots, there was tension between Koreans and between the Black community. There was a tension that was built there because many Korean-run businesses were harmed. In fact, there was even a young girl who was murdered during these riots, and it caused a tension between both those racial minorities. And it can still be said today that there is something to be said about that tension. But within the last 20 years, most of the information I have gotten is from the Butler article that I mentioned in the past. But even during the Obama administration, there was great discrepancy between white versus Black imprisonment. A lot of people make the argument that during the Obama administration, things had changed. And while it did change for representation within the White House and some related racial injustices and just ideologies, just because we have a biracial president in the seat does not mean that oppression is omitted completely. And once again, with relation to the slavery argument that I made earlier, it's similar. Just because you have one thing doesn't mean that the other thing is completely omitted. Representation in the White House does not mean that racism does not exist, and I want that to be heard. But moving on, in around 2006, which again, this is only about 15 years ago, 1 in 9 black men were in prison. In 2010, which is only 10 years ago, there were nearly 1 million blacks in prisons, and nearly 1 in 3 black men have a criminal case, which means every 1 in 3 black men that you see today have a criminal record or something that they have been accused of doing, or not just accused, but they have been seen to have been doing. And that moves on to kind of black employment rate. That is almost twice the white unemployment rate, which I think definitely can play into the criminal case or criminal records. It is to say that if somebody has a criminal case / criminal record, they are definitely marginalized or targeted for not being able to get themselves a job. There are definitely regulations and implementations that do not allow past criminals to get themselves a job. On top of that, there are many industries and companies that won't even hire people with a criminal record, which is understandable in some cases, but most of these men have a criminal case, but most likely are not justified to have done it. And African Americans make up 13% of the U.S. population. That's on account for 20% of people fatally shot by police. And that's just, it's terrible, honestly. I mean, that's half the percentage of the 24% of people fatally shot by police. And it's scary, frankly, because, as I mentioned before, the African American population does not take up nearly as much of the U.S. population as whites and even other Hispanic identifying minorities and similar cases. They definitely don't take up most of the U.S.'s population. So for them to take up half of the fatally shot by police and the percentage that is scary. So it's even more scary that 24% of people fatally shot by police is like information that you can find. But moving on, there are more blacks in the criminal justice system now, incarcerated, on probation, or parole, awaiting trial, all those examples, than there were slaves in the 1850s. Again, this information is coming back from 2010, but as I mentioned, that's only 10 years ago. So there's something to be said about that, that there are more blacks in the criminal justice system than there were slaves in 1850. And as I mentioned before, 1850, that's almost 200 years ago, little less, but 2010 is only 10 years ago. So the fact that we've moved those stereotypes in today's society and we can still find those evidence is scary. And as for incarceration rates, the United States has the highest by far. We incarcerate 750 adults per 100,000. Meanwhile, Germany incarcerates maybe 93 per 100,000. And 3/4 of those imprisonment for drug offenses are black, which again is frightening, because drug offenses are so laxed, and in some cases they probably shouldn't even be a thing, because you're putting especially blacks at this rate because 3/4 of those statistics you're putting these black individuals into prison based on drug offenses. And in many cases, these are probably marijuana offenses, which in many states by now are legalized and should be. And then on the other case, there are many of these drug offenses that probably maybe involve addiction or similar psychological aspects. And in those cases, those people need to be sent to addiction treatment homes, or they need to be sent to a psychologist, a therapist, etc. They do not need to be placed into incarceration and forced to live out their days, because that's not how you treat addiction or similar instances. And moving on, I do want to bring up the colorblind argument that has been a recent evolution in an answer to these issues. I have found all of this information on tolerance.org under colorblindness, the new racism. It pretty much just says the idea that ignoring or overlooking racial and ethnic differences promotes racial harmony. It is used as a failed, unreasonable argument, and it is the new form of racism within our country. Like I said, slavery may no longer exist, but there are definitely evident institutionalized ideas that have become about in our racism. And this is definitely an example of that, of pretty much saying that if I don't see your color, then I don't see your oppression. And it's scary, frankly. But the main issue in the incarceration system is the unjust trials and prosecutions that are happening with no punishments. These people are being placed into incarceration or into a prison, and then they are forced to live out their days. Sometimes they're even omitted out of their case when it comes about that, they didn't do this injustice. But in return, nothing is done, nothing is corrected, and it's really heartbreaking. Moreover, brutality like the Rodney King riots are going unaddressed and ignored by judges and courts. That's just one of many examples. And although these things are addressed and resolved, although these things can be addressed and resolved if we are to make drastic changes and within all forms of government. The experience of the last 100 years teaches us that racial progression in criminal justice is not inevitable, but it is possible, at least in some limited sense. But in the meantime, in 2010, nearly 1 million African Americans anguish in prison and millions more under some of criminal supervision. And again, all that information, all that quotes is coming from the Butler article that I mentioned earlier of the past 100 years and how that relates to criminal injustice and police reform. But that is pretty much all the information I have on the behalf of the history. Once again, I can go over some of the information that I've given, such as the beginning of racism and slavery, how it relates to the Three-Fifths Compromise, the triangular trade in the Middle Passage, then moving on to the last 100 years and how that has related to society. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed everything that has been given, and I hope you're prepared for the next few topics. Thanks, and have a nice day.